Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
With a very important conversation with the chairman on this GDP day. The headline, as I mentioned, U.S. economy grew faster than expected last quarter on firm demand. And so we turn to the chairman, Jared Bernstein, live from the White House, of course, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to Bloomberg Radio. It's great to see you and appreciate the time here. This is a beautiful headline for you. The first word I heard in the newsroom when I walked in this morning was Goldilocks. But then I talked to Stuart Paul at Bloomberg Economics, and he says, but Joe, it's all about inventory rebuilding, that this is their one-time factors. Prices went up a little bit. You need to slow the enthusiasm. And so I ask you, Jared, how we should be interpreting these data.
Well, it's a great question. First of all, always great to be with you, Joe. You don't want to over-torque or over-index on any one report. And so what we did here at the Council of Economic Advisors, and you can see the blog on our website, is we looked at where GDP has gone since President Biden took office in comparison to a couple of prominent forecasts. And it just kept, our GDP path just kept beating the forecast. You well remember predictions that we would be in a recession or a deep recession by now. Indeed. And yet the strong labor market, strong consumer spending, and in this report, some really nice business investment. So I take the point about inventory. It's the most volatile component of the report. But even if you shave those by half, you still beat expectations. So solid report.
Solid report, and it adds to the mosaic here, if I can use that term, that we're seeing as a potential soft landing. It's my job. I've been asking you this for a year, I think, on a monthly. If this is it, and it sure feels like it, Jared, am I wrong?
Well, I think that the way to look at that question is from the perspective of where we are and what where we are says about where we're going. So where we are is we have a job market that has almost since this president has gotten here, since it was such a strong intention of his to get back to full employment as soon as possible, that has consistently, persistently been in the neighborhood of full employment. And as inflation has eased, that generates real wage gains. That supports strong consumer spending, about 68% of our GDP. So underlying this report, this is kind of my same point about you don't have to over-torque on one report as significant as a beat as it is to understand the fact that we have some very nice momentum, a kind of a perpetual motion forward kind of story with strong labor market, easing prices, real wage gains, real incomes rising, feeding into good consumer spending. That in turn helps to get investors back into the act. And I do think that is very much the characteristic of a steady, solid, ongoing recovery. Call it whatever you want, but that's the way I would take it.
Yeah, well, but it kind of sounds like it. Although I will ask you about government spending, Jared, quite a bit, contributing more here to GDP compared to the first 3 months of the year. Defense spending, a big part of it, helped to offset lower residential investment. Is that sustainable?
I think when you're talking about sustainability of government spending, you're really not talking about a month or a quarter or even a year. You're talking about the long term. I mean, the sustainability question in the near term is really a question of how liquid is the market for borrowing, for selling government bonds. And, the auction, you look at the auctions, look at the bid covers, and, you see that those are still very robust and that there's persistent and deep global demand for U.S. debt. That's all great. But the sustainability question asks, what about over the long term? If outlays continue to outrun receipts, revenues, eventually that arithmetic can be extremely constricting, especially if you believe we're in somewhat of a higher interest rate environment, so that debt service is pressured. And that's why our budget in the long term, over 10 years, has very significant deficit reduction based on both revenue increases at the very top of the scale and cutting spending. So I think the sustainability question is a longer term question. You have to address it. Our budget does that, but we need Congress to work with us on it.
Well, yeah, Jared, they just went home. I'm trying to figure out the next move here because they're going to come back in September. We're going to be talking about the potential for a government shutdown all over again. History repeats itself. How should we be preparing ourselves for this?
It's a really great point. I mean, Jared, they just went home kind of says a lot, right? Because you're like, I'm telling you a very clear arithmetic way forward here. This is not rocket science. It's pluses and minuses, with some interest rates and some compounding thrown in. And if people are not going to, if members of policymakers are not going to take this seriously, of course, we're going to have a problem. Look, I am not going to get political here because that's not my job. But I do think that people who are concerned about this should look at the record and at the budgets of what people are proposing. Now, we know that the guy we're running against wants to pass an unfunded $5 trillion tax cut. We know that the other side, the Republicans, have signed pledges never to raise revenues. And the only spending they've cut has been in some very narrow areas. So again, I think look to the budgets and you get a sense of who's serious and who isn't.
I've been asking you for months and months, a couple of years, I guess, Jared, about what the economy would look like for Joe Biden in a second term. I can't ask you that anymore. But when you look at the trajectory of data here, I won't ask you what the Fed's going to be doing. But if you map this out 6 to 9 months, and Kamala Harris is the next president, what will she be inheriting?
Well, I think one answer to that is to look at a document that probably hasn't gotten a lot of attention, which is the mid-session review that we published last Friday, because that has our forecast in it. It's nothing revolutionary. It's pretty much a similar forecast if you looked at Blue Chip or CBO for that matter. A few differences here and there. But that's our answer to that question. And it says pretty much, what you're seeing now, steady, stable growth around inflation back to something that looks like the target. And it's that latter part that's so important. I'm giving a speech next week where I'm going to focus on the almost round trip of inflation, the fact that inflation, went up to peak at 9+% in June of 22. We're now looking at 3% year over year. We'll learn more about PCE inflation tomorrow. But if you listen to the language of the Fed, they're pretty much telling you that they view themselves as on their way back to the target, and that the kind of pause in disinflation that characterized Q1 seems to be largely behind us, and that the forces of disinflation are in play again. And I think that's key for the economy that President Harris would inherit, one where inflation was back down, and some of the factors that led to the high inflation, particularly snarled supply chains and misalignments of that type relative to the pandemic, are solidly behind us.
Pretty remarkable answer, Jared. So the timing sounds like it could be impeccable for a Kamala Harris presidency if she wins, on target, is what you're saying. I know your time is tight. I want to ask you about this. Go ahead.
I think that every forecast has a confidence interval around it, but that is, I think, the central forecast. Yeah.
I love that term, confidence interval. Joe Biden spoke to the nation last evening. Jared, you've known him for a really long time. Were you at the White House last night? How did you watch the speech?
Yeah, I was around, and extremely moving. And you're right. I've been close to the president for decades. The guy we saw last night is the guy I've known and loved for a long time. It's been it continues to be an absolute honor to work with him. And I should tell you that the message from him to our team is we are not done, folks. We got 6 months of work to do under this president, where we're going to continue delivering for the American people. So my shirt sleeves remain rolled up.
That would imply then that you are confident he can finish the job. You see him and talk to him more than most Americans.
Oh, unquestionably. He is ready to get back to work. He's here. He's meeting today, as you just discussed, foreign leaders and on the economy. I know he liked that GDP report, so he and I'll have more to say about that. And he is, as I said, our marching orders are very clear. We're going to keep building on the progress we've made thus far. We got a great GDP report. We have inflation coming down, 16 million jobs and counting, manufacturing, domestic. One of the message from him is implementation, implementing the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. That's real work. And Biden has always been an implementation guy. He is not a president who says, sign the bill and let's move on. He wants to make sure that what we said we're going to do for the American people is what we're going to do. So our work is still cut out for us.
We talk about good news and bad news, Jared, but it always means a lot to us to get some time with you. We appreciate it very much. Jared Bernstein chairs the White House Council of Economic Advisors and one of Joe Biden's closest advisors, certainly when it comes to the economy. Thank you, as always.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Back alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where it's been a busy week, to say the least. A week that started Sunday with the announcement that Joe Biden was no longer seeking re-election to a second term, something that he formally announced to the nation in an address from the Oval Office in prime time last night. But if you were looking for an explanation as to why exactly he did this, what convinced him to leave the race, you may not have gotten that answer, but we did get this.
I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. There is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. But there's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices.
Of course, one of those voices belonging to Kamala Harris, and we'll be talking a lot more about her campaign. They're out with their first video today with questions about why they're not up on the air, even though it's been only 3 days. But we want to stick with this for one moment. While it may have been anticlimactic several days after Joe Biden sent the letter stating his intentions, last evening was important, and we're joined to talk about it by Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg White House correspondent. Josh, it's great to have you. He's spent only 11 minutes talking to the American people. Give us a sense of what went into this speech. There were a lot of questions, to Kailey's point, I think, about why he didn't speak to the actual reason why he was leaving this race. Did they think they did a good job? Did they get their job done through the eyes of the administration?
Biden likes talking to historians, and one of them helped him write his speech last night. I think that helps frame where they were at. Okay. This felt like a capstone for him. A couple hundred staff poured in to the residents to watch it, some of them teary-eyed, and they gave a big rah-rah thing in the Rose Garden afterwards. It felt like a goodbye. It felt like a retirement party at the White House. So that was the lens on it. I think he did nod to uniting his party, which is what happened here, right? It was the growing revolt, and in particular the questions about whether Joe Biden would drag down House and Senate Democrats and not just himself, that really seems to have been decisive. Remember, he said there were only 3 things that would let him step aside. One, the Lord Almighty, and so far as we know, that was not the case, but I suppose I'm stand to be corrected. Number 2, a major health incident, ditto. We have no indication of that. And number 3, if his aides told him he could not win. So it looks like it was door number 3, and that's what led to the decision Sunday, the very surprising one. The rapid coalescence around Vice President Harris since then, and this speech yesterday. Biden was defiant. You can tell he's still a little ticked. He had a line about thinking that his record deserves a kick at the can to run at a second term. Yeah. And, Jill Biden's statement, his wife's statement was...
To those who never wavered.
A bit of an eyebrow raiser. Yes, exactly. She's from Philadelphia, I will note. So that, I think, he's going, but it's a bit kicking.
We're seeing some images, by the way, so our viewers know. This is from following the speech. He actually had family members in the Oval Office.
Yes, many of whom boarded the plane with the First Lady right after to go to the Paris Olympics. And, Biden's a family guy. Not too surprising that they would be there, but that's, he's insisting on running, on serving out the end of his term.
Yeah.
The press secretary spent all the briefing yesterday really insisting that that would be the case. But as I say, yesterday really felt like the last, speech that a lot of people are going to tune in on for what Joe Biden has to say. Now, there is work to be done. He alluded to yesterday Supreme Court reform, ethics reform that he wants to do. Not clear to me whether he means calling for it or attempting to do it by executive order, which would be a fight at the very least, but perhaps a fight he's willing to have. And of course, talks on Gaza, which relates to today's meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's scheduled to begin any minute now at the White House, Josh. And he did talk about how he wants to see an end to the war in Gaza, peace and security in the Middle East he wants to achieve. Obviously, a lofty goal. Many others have tried to achieve that as well. So knowing that Biden is looking out for his legacy here, that he knows he's going to be a one-termer, does that mean Netanyahu might be a little bit more in for it than he otherwise would have been? Today, what kind of Biden is Netanyahu about to meet with?
Netanyahu seems to believe the opposite. He seems to believe that he should be cozying up to Trump as much, if not more, than Democrats. I suppose it remains to be seen. I think Biden does have now more leeway to strike a deal that might be politically dicey if it gets to that point. But he has more bandwidth to do it. I will say, last week as we sat here 1 week ago, people were saying Biden's running, he's dead set on it. By the way, people believe that to be the case. They do not believe that he was days and days hiding a decision. But he had his big defenders, including some publicly, including lawmakers, the Congressional Black Caucus, for instance. In the last 24 hours since his speech, there have not been a lot of second thoughts. You don't have a lot of people thinking, oh, did we make the right choice? Oh, should Joe have stuck around? It seems to be the opposite. It's a sigh of relief that the tension, at the very least in the party, is over, and Harris really has a firm grip, if not 100% locked up the nomination, and it's sort of all systems go. I will note that both Biden himself in speaking to staff and the First Lady in her slightly salty statement did say, we got to rally around Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Josh, it's great to have you. Thank you for sharing that with us. As
Thank
always,
you.
Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg White House correspondent with The View inside the White House on an historic evening. The images that we were just showing you from the Oval Office are authentic. Those were not staged following the speech. It was not part of the programming. And the same will be today when we get inside the Oval Office with Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. This is not a speech or a news conference. They're going to be sitting down. The press pool will be allowed in the room for a moment to get some video, get some brief remarks from the president. If not both, we'll bring that to you when it happens, likely this hour. The press just gathering for that opportunity right now as we add the voice of Carmiel Arbit, Senior Fellow for Middle East Programs at the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Carmiel, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. It's always our pleasure to have you here. Coming off of the speech to a joint session of Congress yesterday, Benjamin Netanyahu brings his message to the Oval Office today. And coming off of this speech from Joe Biden last night, in which he implied the ceasefire in Hamas is going to be his priority as he finishes out his one and only term. Will there be progress made today when these two meet?
Well, thank you so much for having me on again. Bibi is coming off a speech to Congress where he was well received. He enjoyed standing ovations from members of Congress, but wasn't especially substantive in terms of the commitments that he was willing to make towards achieving that ceasefire, which on the one hand, he says he's interested in, and that Hamas is the number one barrier to achieving. And on the other hand, his political interests have been served, much like they have Haniyeh and the leadership of Hamas, continuing this conflict. That said, we've heard that they're very close to a breakthrough, that they're getting closer to an agreement that would look at some kind of a short-term, less than 2 months ceasefire in exchange for the release of women, elderly, and injured, that could then be phased into a longer-term ceasefire. So I think the moment is more hopeful than it had been in the last few weeks and months. But let's not hold our breath. It's not done until it's done.
Well, that's absolutely true. And Carmiel, I think we should all remind ourselves of the kind of tenor of the speech that we saw Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu give on the floor of the House chamber yesterday, especially when it comes to what he called his vision for Gaza. This is how he laid it out.
The day after we defeat Hamas a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there to prevent the resurgence of terror, to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
Is that a vision you think the U.S. and President Biden could get behind, Carmiel?
Look, I think this is something that Bibi has been saying multiple times in different ways in different speeches. So we didn't really hear anything new substantively from him yesterday. I think the real question is how to achieve a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. And there's no clear path to that. Only about half of Hamas's soldiers have been taken out, about half of the leadership. They're still very far from getting to the point where the Israelis would be able to, quote, claim victory. And so I think certainly everybody is looking for a Gaza that is not occupied by Israel, that is independent, that is peacefully living alongside Israel. But how we get from point A to point B is where we're going to see lots of tension points between both parties.
How different will Joe Biden's meeting be with Benjamin Netanyahu compared to Kamala Harris's meeting later?
Yeah, it's very interesting that they're having these two meetings separately. Of course, as we kind of get ready for what Bibi sees as kind of this lame duck Biden, Netanyahu is really holding out. He thinks that whatever happens, he's going to get a better deal if Trump is in power, because Trump isn't going to extract any concessions from him. And so I think Netanyahu is going to continue to be reluctant to deliver anything that would seem to bolster Biden or kind of help him. Biden's ambitions for an end to this conflict are very lofty. It's not just, as we discussed, a demilitarized Gaza or a de-radicalized Gaza. He's also looking for a grand deal, something that would bring an agreement between the U.S., Saudi and Israel, and then Israel and the Palestinians to the table. And I think that's going to be a huge focus for him in his final months in office, and he'll have time and space to do it. I think Biden is, as he has said, a Zionist, someone who feels very deeply connected to the state of Israel, but increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu. I think Harris is going to be coming at this from a slightly different place. I think she's a bit more pragmatic. I think she's a little bit less emotionally attached to this conflict, but ultimately she's going to continue to toe the line of this administration as vice president. And the only time that could change is if she's elected president, and will have to start to lay her own path for her relationship with Israel.
Well, Carmiel, as you talk about the idea that Biden does seem to want some kind of grand deal here, he did allude to that in his speech last night. He didn't just say an end to the war in Gaza, but peace and security in the Middle East. So while he may be most immediately focused on the conflict between Israel and Hamas, I wonder if you still see room for other conflict areas to open up, considering that Netanyahu in that speech yesterday talked about Hezbollah and that Israel will do whatever it can to secure its northern border. He said, and this is a quote, "Those who attack Israel will pay a very heavy price." Is peace and security in the Middle East as a whole, not just in Gaza, a bit of a reach even for this president?
So I think we have to break down the different pieces of what's happening in the region. I think we've already seen, and Netanyahu referred to an Abraham alliance, something that's been worked on behind the scenes a bit to bring together all of the countries who helped Israel respond to the Iranian strikes on Israeli territory. I think on the one hand, there's a huge amount of potential to bring together, Gulf countries, allies with those who are already allied with Israel, and those who are interested in allying with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, to respond to the threat posed by Iran and its proxies. So I think we have to differentiate. There's a space for cooperation among allies, and there's also a space for a significant escalation in this war. And we have seen now the Houthis are willing to not just strike Israel. The Houthis have struck Israel 200 times. But this past week was the first time where there was an actual casualty, and that prompted an Israeli response. I think we're going to continue to see that escalation, but we're going to see on the one hand bonds that are formed between like-minded allies and escalation with Iran and Iranian-backed proxies.
Benjamin Netanyahu moves on to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump tomorrow, Carmiel. What's the point? What will they discuss?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a number of different things discussed. One is that there's some tension right now between Bibi and Trump. Trump is frustrated that Netanyahu had welcomed Biden and hadn't, played into Trump's claims of election fraud. So there had been some personal friction points where Trump has said disparaging things about Netanyahu. I think once they're kind of past the kissing the ring formalities of it, they're going to talk substance. And what I would expect is that Netanyahu and Trump are going to talk about what a strong U.S.'s relationship will look like under a Trump administration, and how Trump will support Netanyahu, irrespective of what is happening domestically or what is happening vis-a-vis the Palestinians.
Carmiel, it's always great to have you, especially on a week like this one where we see Netanyahu spending so much time on U.S. soil, not just here in Washington, but of course in Florida tomorrow. Carmiel Arbit of the Atlantic Council, where she is Senior Fellow for the Middle East Programs at the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. We always appreciate it. It's going to be pretty remarkable as we look to get the images from this meeting in the Oval Office between Biden and Netanyahu. It raises the question of how the intensity of these various private meetings with three different either current or potentially future U.S. presidents could go for Netanyahu, how they may differ in tone and in conduct and body language, to your point, Jeff.
That's for sure. And sometimes you can read into that a bit with the extent to which the press is allowed to be exposed to what's happening. Apparently, it was a very brief visit in the Oval Office. We'll have some images and video for you coming up, but no questions were answered, certainly not about a ceasefire. And I think the idea was to get him in, get him out, because this might not be the most comfortable meeting. Yeah. Same could be said for Kamala Harris's. To Carmiel's point, once we're through the pleasantries.
Yeah, and of course, they'll be meeting with hostage families as well in between those meetings. So a lot is ahead on the White House. We're going to have more on this with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It's certainly been a busy few days, and that continues at the White House today as President Biden sits down in the Oval Office with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This, of course, follows the fiery address Netanyahu gave to a joint session of Congress yesterday, which many Democrats expressed displeasure with, especially for some of his rhetoric when it comes to the protesters that were here in D.C. and, frankly, Joe, are still present today.
They
but
sure are.
But it obviously just speaks to the very politically charged nature of this entire visit. And it comes against a backdrop of course, President Biden having just spoken to the nation about his decision to effectively make himself a lame duck and no longer seek a second term.
Yeah, there are images of Netanyahu and Biden in the Oval Office. They took a couple of moments to talk with members of the press, very brief here, knowing that Netanyahu will also be sitting down with Kamala Harris a bit later on. And then tomorrow, Kailey, it's on to Mar-a-Lago, and apparently a much closer friend in Donald Trump, who the Israeli prime minister will be sitting down with, I guess, as he hedges his relationships here ahead of November. Yeah,
it was interesting to watch Netanyahu's speech yesterday, in which he did thank Joe Biden for being a friend to Israel. He called him a proud Irish-American Zionist. He thanked him especially for the coordination of intercepting the Iran missile and drone attack back in April. But his words about Donald Trump were a bit lengthier, listing off a long list of things that he said Donald Trump did for Israel when he was president. It seems like there may have been a little more love there, although I guess that's open up to an individual's perceptions.
Donald Trump did another rally yesterday.
He did.
You saw that?
Yes. North Carolina.
North Carolina, one of the 7 swing states we're following here, of course, in our Bloomberg swing state poll. The rhetoric, though, is what we're seizing on here, as some members of the Republican conference in the House refer to Kamala Harris as a DEI hire, a DEI vice president. We have a bit of a taste of Donald Trump's language from yesterday. Let's listen.
We have a new victim to defeat. Lion Kamala Harris, Lion, L-Y-I-N apostrophe. The most incompetent and far left vice president in American history.
So let's debrief on that rally and this language a little bit more with our political panel. Joining us now is our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. So we saw that kind of throughout the rally, Rick, as well as it seemed almost every single time he said the name of the vice president, mispronouncing it. It's obviously Kamala Harris, not Kamala Harris. Rick, is this going to work for Donald Trump, or does this risk backfiring on him?
Yeah, clearly his ear's feeling better because when it was hurting, he wanted to talk about unity. Now he's just back to being the Donald Trump we've known for a decade. Yeah, I don't think he can help himself. I think that this is going to be how he finishes this campaign. A lot of Republicans worried. They saw his speech, in Milwaukee after all the claims that he was going to be a unifier, use this moment in time, the assassination attempt, as a way of bringing in other voters. Has really reversed itself completely. This is the Donald Trump that started the campaign 2 years ago, attacking Joe Biden personally about his age and acuity, and he's just found his bearings with Kamala Harris. And the reality is, it doesn't seem to be taken off. Even some discussion within the party, people I've spoken to are worried that this kind of approach is not going to work with a fresh, young face compared to Donald Trump. And we even see it some in the polling data already since the convention. So, and since the president's withdrawal from the race on Sunday. So I think he's entering this in sort of his old-fashioned way, but I think that the party is going to be looking for a change in approach if they want to win this election.
Certainly the speaker is, as reports now say, Rick and Jeanne, that Mike Johnson actually had to speak to the rank and file in a conference meeting this week to ask them to tamp down the rhetoric after we heard Tim Burchett call Kamala Harris a DEI vice president. Glenn Grothman said she got the nod here by Democrats this week, quote, because of her ethnic background, unquote, in an interview with CBS. Jeanne, how should Kamala Harris address this kind of talk, if at all?
It is abhorrent. It is racist. It is sexist. It is nothing new for Donald Trump and many of his MAGA supporters. And so the fact that it doesn't seem to be landing is a good sign. But this is what we've grown to know, and what we have, the reason so many Americans are not willing to entertain another Donald Trump presidency. That's why he's got this ceiling he just can't break through. To win elections, you have to reach out. He wanted to run against Joe Biden because Joe Biden was stuck just like Donald Trump is. And Vice President Harris is not. This is going to be a hard fight for her. She's going to have to put up with this racist, sexist language. But she has been doing that for her entire professional career. And so I think from her perspective, she sticks to her argument. She is a former prosecutor. She is the sitting vice president. He is a convicted felon, and she is prepared to match him in debates. She is prepared to go head to head with him on policy issues, because those are areas where she can make a case. Again, it's going to be a hard case, but it's going to be a case that she can make.
Well, I would point out it's not just Donald Trump whose comments have gotten some attention here, but as well his vice presidential selection, J.D. Vance of Ohio, for specifically what he said about Kamala Harris being, quote unquote, childless. We now have the ex-wife of Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, who, of course, they share his two children. She is their stepmom, defending her on this. We've even seen celebrities get involved, like Jennifer Aniston. So, Rick, what about the J.D. Vance aspect of this? And do you think there might be some buyer's remorse happening within the Trump campaign, not just because of language like that, but because, of course, he was selected before Kamala Harris was understood to be atop the Democratic ticket?
Yeah, these comments made in a 2021 interview with Tucker Carlson kind of branded J.D. Vance as, insensitive on issues related to women, picking a fight then with Jennifer Aniston over the comments. I can only see one resolution of this: a public apology on a neutral network by J.D. Vance in the coming days. They've got to get out of this mix. They're already taking a lot of weight on. They're getting killed with women's voters in all the targeted states. There's some new polling out since the Sunday announcement that shows significant leads by the Democrats with women voters, and frankly, a kind of stagnation with the male vote. You would have thought that with this high testosterone approach coming out of Milwaukee, J.D. Vance really only appeals to male voters, that they would get some uplift, and if anything, it's suppressed the vote. So there's a real problem inside the Trump campaign. They've got a running mate who's started out with kind of a lose-lose approach to being the nominee, and Donald Trump really having a hard time finding his footing with Harris and how to really juxtapose them on a substantive basis. That said, with all the good economic news, if you were giving advice to the Democrats, just talk about the economic performance of our country right now and finish the campaign there, because that is where most of the voters are. They care about the economy and who's going to do the best job for them.
Spending time with our panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino here on Bloomberg TV and radio as we stand by for an important conversation. Bloomberg's Emily Chang will be holding forth with Lina Khan from the FTC a little bit less than 10 minutes from now. We'll bring you that live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Jeanne, it points us to the Veep stakes. We just spent a lot of time trying to figure out who Donald Trump would tap as a running mate. And you have both just illustrated the backdrop for Kamala Harris's decision. Who are you looking at right now? And is it, in fact, a white male Rust Belt governor? Fill in the blank on the name.
It is. Well, I think there's also the Sun Belt senator you can look at as well. I actually am more around the map, if you will. I do think Josh Shapiro has many people's support and vote. For obvious reasons, I would say one drawback to the very popular Governor Shapiro is that he too has a background like Kamala Harris, both prosecutors. So you wonder if in doing something like that, she would be doubling up in the way Donald Trump did with J.D. Vance. But I do think he's leading the short list. I also think that Senator Kelly would be a remarkable choice. He might open up the Sun Belt a little more. And of course, he is an astronaut, so you lead with that. It's hard to go wrong. He isn't quite as energizing on the stump as some of the other folks, but he's a very, very good choice. I also think Governor Cooper, I think that is why, one of the reasons why we saw Donald Trump down in North Carolina yesterday. I think there is some fear that getting somebody more mature, somebody who has been around, and somebody who has spent a lot of time talking about women's bodies and reproduction is something that could elicit some fear. So I think there's a lot of really good choices there. And it looks like we're going to know in the next week, if not sooner.
It sure sounds like it. And we'll be talking to Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis about it, our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors, thank you both, as always, being with us here on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
A day after the big speech, there were no surprises, of course. Joe Biden already let us know on letterhead on Sunday that he would not be continuing his campaign to run for re-election. But he did address the American people from the Oval Office last evening. Here's a taste.
I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. But there's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices.
And one in particular, named Kamala Harris, we're now following as the nominee in waiting. Joe Biden there in the Oval Office, he spoke for just shy of 10 minutes, had family in the room with him, some very touching photographs of him with the First Lady and some of his kids. Hunter Biden was in the Oval Office. I guess he got a round of applause from those who were there, saying what we already knew. Sometimes it's different when you actually see it and hear it. Surprising, maybe not surprising. No mention of his age and the actual reason why he's leaving this race. So let's get into it with an authority. Kristen Hawn, I'm glad to say, is with us, partner at ROKK Solutions and one of the most connected Democratic operatives in Washington at the table. Kristen, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming in here. Were you sad after watching this, or is this a great moment for America?
I mean, I think there was such a juxtaposition between what President Biden has said and what we've seen. You know, I think a lot of people, Trump was quiet for a little while. He was, I don't know who got him to be quiet for a little while, but he was it was more subdued. And I think we just saw in the last couple of days him saying that America is stupid and it's a stupid country. And I think watching President Biden is exactly what it means to be presidential. I mean, he's putting, like he said, the future of our democracy, the future of this country is bigger than my own ambition. And that's the exact opposite in what we're seeing in the Republican candidate. So I think it was very heartfelt. I think people looked at it. They appreciated the leadership and the guidance this president has given us over the last 3.5 years. And then also a lot of excitement about the vice president and her candidacy. And, you've seen it reflected in not only fundraising numbers, but also volunteers, people coming out. I'm feeling it here in Washington among the people that I'm working with as well. Yeah. So I think it was a kind of a solemn moment, but it was a hopeful message that he delivered. Well,
I heard from a number of people over the weekend, as I'm sure you did too, and surrounding the speech last night, even following it this morning. Some people are still angry. They feel like they were misled and that this White House wasn't honest with them about Joe Biden's condition. And I wonder if you're hearing that from inside Democratic circles as well.
I'm not hearing a lot of anger. I think that there are a number of people who thought this decision should have been made sooner. And, but we are where we are. We've got plenty of time going forward. We've got a strong candidate in the vice president, and she's come out of the gate strong. But no, not necessarily anger, but, there was a lot of confusion, not knowing what's going on, who's in the ear of the president, what's happening. You saw Senator Tim Kaine talking in public and on air, talking about him getting, polling numbers back in Virginia. Yeah. And Virginia is now at risk, and there was a real concern, I mean, particularly amongst, my friends who are in the House, that the backstop, I mean, if you look at the map, it's going to be difficult to maintain control over the Senate. The backstop is the House. And we were looking at potentially, not losing the House because we don't have control of the House right now. But, it was almost assured that we were going to take back the House, and that wasn't the case. And that really started to scare a lot of people.
That's what woke up the sleeping giant here, I guess. So bring us behind the scenes and how quickly all of this happened. I remember talking to Joe Biden in New Hampshire when he was first running here against Donald Trump in 2020. And he was leaving New Hampshire to basically, go in the fetal position and end the campaign. And then something happened, as you remember. Jim Clyburn steps in. Everyone drops out overnight. All of a sudden, you're the nominee, and welcome to South Carolina. It kind of felt like that here, where there was all kinds of chatter about, do we have a mini primary? Look at these great governors. Somebody call Michigan. Somebody call California. Oh, I know, we've got Kamala. And then suddenly that talk stopped. A flow of endorsements. All the governors we mentioned endorsed her. And it does make people wonder who's pulling the strings here. How do things happen that quickly when a party apparatus can turn on a dime?
I think that you talked about it being chatter. I think there's a lot of gossip, a lot of rumor going around. I think, the fact that we have so many potential, candidates for president, it's an embarrassment of riches, and I think that's great. I don't think there was, and nobody I talked to, there was ever a chance that you've got a strong vice president and Vice President Harris, that we were going to, the Democratic Party was going to pass over her, who's currently the vice president, a strong woman of color for anybody else. So it's not surprising to me actually at all, and I don't think to most people I'm talking to that happened so quickly.
When does Barack Obama come around? NBC is reporting the endorsement soon. I mean, got the delegates locked up. What are we waiting for here? If not a dramatic introduction or announcement at the convention, how's that going to play out?
I think, it's I don't think there was any after President Biden, very quickly endorsed her. Yeah. I don't think that there was any question that the other party leaders were going to do it.
You just want to stagger these to get the news out of each one of them?
I don't know. If I'm in that position and I'm guessing, yes. I mean,
give it a week.
You don't want to do it all at the same time. Give it a week. That's going to be a huge endorsement by the former President Obama. So, I think, the more you can stagger these out, the more you drive the news,
sure.
and you're driving positive headlines.
Yes, right.
And the whole objective is to bring these voters back in, and younger voters, and we're not quite where we were among younger voters as we were when President Obama was running.
It's just a funny game. It's not like he's going to endorse Trump, but listen, I realize that's how it's played.
Yeah.
Bring me back into the Oval Office last night. Should Joe Biden have talked about the why? Or is that just implicit? Should he not have said, I'm not getting out of bed the way I used to? Yeah, you're right. You saw me in that debate. That's why I'm doing this.
I think no. And I think a lot of it was implicit when he said, and yes, somebody younger, handing over to, the next generation. Yes. And he acknowledged, yes, somebody younger. Implicit in that is we need somebody younger. So I think there was a lot of, and there's not a whole lot of nuance there. It's pretty
Sure.
on the nose.
Yeah, right.
But
he
I
also needs to make people think he can finish the job.
That's true. And he did say, I'm here, finishing the job. I think that if he had said, I can't do all these things, then you're exactly right. Then why are you staying in office? I think he's completely able to finish the job. He said, that's what I'm going to focus my energy on that rather than having to campaign and do that at the same time.
Sure.
So I think he struck the right tone.
Will this be the lamest of lame duck sessions in our remaining moment, knowing that
oh my gosh,
he's done?
I mean, I think also when you have to look at lame duck, everybody thinks about the lame duck president.
Yeah.
But you also look at the makeup of the Congress.
100%.
So a lame duck president, say he was a lame duck president with Democratic control of the House and Democratic control of the Senate, then you're we got to do 8,000 things before.
Not this time, though, huh?
Not this time. Yeah. So I think, you're probably looking at a very lame duck.
So you're going to come back here in a month after Chicago. You know what we're going to be talking about is a government shutdown. Countdown to the shutdown with Kristen Hawn.
Yep.
Make your reservation now. You're going to be in Chicago, right?
Yes.
We're going to spend some time around this DNC, which is going to be a whole different process than we expected. Does she get the virtual nod, or does that happen in Chicago?
I think she'll probably get the virtual nod, but
it's next week or something.
Yeah.
All right.
But,
we'll talk more about this.
Chicago will be great.
ROKK Solutions partner. I told you she was coming in. Kristen Hawn on the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.